Hello again. Many world leaders yesterday sent their best wishes to President Trump. This morning, the Chinese president has done the same. Xi Jinping sending a message through official state media saying that he wishes US President Donald Trump and Melania Trump a speedy recovery following their COVID-19 diagnosis. That coming through in the last few moments. Well, President Trump was airlifted to military hospital less than 24 hours after testing positive for coronavirus. He insists everything is going well, promising to make sure that things work out. But what effect could Trump's diagnosis have on the final month of the presidential campaign? Well, joining me now is Associate Professor of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick, Dr. Trevor McCrisken. Good to see you this morning. Thanks very much for being with us. So the president airlifted overnight to hospital. Clearly, there are concerns about his health. What will this mean in the vital last few weeks of campaigning?
Well, obviously, it's not ideal for the Trump campaign, is it? They've planned all sorts of outdoor events and big rallies, etc., that they would be doing over the final month of the campaign. And obviously, Donald Trump can't take part in those anymore. He's going to have to obviously take it easy now. He's in the hospital. We don't even know how much online campaigning he'll be able to do. And it's been quite interesting over the last 24 hours since the diagnosis came out. I was expecting him to tweet a lot more, but actually, I think he's only put out a couple of tweets so far. So we may not hear very much from Donald Trump over the next couple of weeks that he's in quarantine. And obviously, if he doesn't make a speedy recovery, it might be right up to Election Day. So that does mean that his vice presidential candidate, Mike Pence, I think is going to have to take a lot of the campaigning forward now up to Election Day on the 3rd of November.
Yeah, so does this really give Joe Biden the advantage now?
Well, it might do, but it's difficult really to say how this will play out. Biden's already made it clear that he's going to be quite cautious about taking too much political advantage here. He doesn't want to be seen as kind of kicking the president while he's in hospital, being too critical of him. And it actually probably makes it quite difficult now for the Biden campaign, because they would have been, I think, attacking the record of President Trump, also suggesting that his temperament, as we saw in the debate earlier this week, which seems like an eternity ago now, but he was demonstrating there that he obviously has quite a high temper, maybe isn't the kind of person that a lot of Americans would like to see as their president. That's something that Biden was going to play on. I think it's going to be much harder for him now to do so. And there's also, of course, all the questions about the degree to which President Trump hasn't taken coronavirus very seriously over the last several months. And that's another major part of the criticism that the Biden campaign has. They could, of course, now make a big deal of the fact that because he was so cavalier about coronavirus, wasn't wearing face coverings, that's potentially why he's now contracted COVID-19. But they've got to be very careful about how they do that, I think.
Yeah, they certainly don't want to seem to be gloating in any way, do they? But interesting that Joe Biden has pulled all negative campaign ads about the president.
Yeah, and that sends that signal that he's not wanting to sort of take full advantage of the fact that his opponent is now in ill health. And I think he does fear that maybe if he went too much on the attack now, that would backfire on his campaign. Of course, for Trump supporters as well, they now are going to be watching very carefully what happens to the president over the next few weeks. It may actually strengthen the support for Trump, because people perhaps will feel sorry for him and feel more inclined to vote for him. But I think that the question of health does often come up in the last few weeks leading up to a presidential election. If candidates look like they're flagging, criticisms can be made and questions raised about whether they would be able to cope in the office, etc. Those sorts of criticisms are now going to be much harder for Trump to kind of combat, when obviously he's in hospital at the moment and could be for some time. So it will be interesting to see how this plays out.
Do you think we'll see any more presidential debates, or do you think they'll be cancelled now? Because, of course, the next one due in Florida, I think, in a couple of weeks. I mean, it could be held virtually, I suppose, if the president is up to it.
Yeah, I think it entirely depends on how his health develops over the coming days. I mean, as you've mentioned in some of your reports earlier, obviously earlier in the year, our own Prime Minister Boris Johnson contracted COVID-19, seemed at first that he could carry on his duties, but then reached a point where he had to be hospitalised, and it actually got very serious. That, of course, could happen with Donald Trump. We don't quite know how this is going to play out, but it does throw really big doubt, I think, over that October 15th, only 2 weeks after the diagnosis, so at the end of the initial quarantine period, that next presidential debate is due to take place. But we do have a vice presidential debate this coming week with Mike Pence facing up against Kamala Harris. That has even more seriousness now, I suppose, because obviously if the worst were to happen and Trump weren't to recover, then Mike Pence is obviously, as vice president, next in line to become president of the United States for the rest of this term, and potentially would end up being the candidate for the Republican Party should Trump have to withdraw from the race. So the vice presidential debate this coming Wednesday, which to some extent might have been considered a bit of a sideshow, now will have everybody's eyes on it, because it will be really important to see how these two potential presidents really might sort of size up against each other.
And if he does take a turn for the worst, is there a chance that the election could be postponed? Part of the problem is many Americans have already voted.
Yeah, I don't think that it will be postponed. It's very difficult to do so. Congress set the date for the election a long time ago. They could delay it, but there has to be constitutionally a transfer of power to the next presidential administration on January 20th. And the Electoral College has to meet and cast its votes by December. So I think the election will go ahead. It will still have Trump and Pence as the Republican candidates. But of course, it might be, depending on what happens with Trump, that Pence ends up being the kind of main candidate. The Republican National Committee may end up having to decide, again, depending on what happens with Trump, that Pence becomes the candidate even. I think we're getting ahead of ourselves a bit. We obviously saw those pictures yesterday and Donald Trump looked in pretty good health, but it's hard to predict, obviously, what could occur. But there are processes in place that would enable a transfer of power either to the vice president or to other individuals within the political system, should it come to pass that Trump and maybe other members of his team end up becoming so unwell that they can't participate any further in politics, or even have to withdraw from the presidency altogether. So these provisions are in place. But I think, yes, that election will take place on November 3rd, but it's going to be in a very different context than perhaps we could have imagined.
Yeah, incredible, isn't it? So many unknowns. Many thanks indeed for your analysis. As always, Dr. Trevor McCrisken from Warwick University. Thanks. Now, it's been a miserable morning for many of us weather-wise. Let's get the details.